Those notes are worthless. The words landed with the confidence of a man who had spent 40 years believing he could recognize value the second he saw it. Richard Whitmore leaned back in his chair and held the worn notebook between two fingers as if it were little more than a forgotten receipt. Around him, soft laughter rippled through the glass-walled conference room on the 43rd floor. Outside, late afternoon sunlight reflected off hundreds of downtown windows, turning the skyline into a sea of gold. Inside, the mood was light, relaxed, almost celebratory. In less than 72 hours, Whitmore Dynamics would unveil the most advanced smart tower ever built in the state. Reporters were already calling it a landmark. Investors called it a masterpiece. Richard simply called it proof. Proof that he was always right. Across the room stood Maya Carter, 17 years old, dark curls pulled back neatly, thrift store blazer, scuffed sneakers. She looked painfully out of place among the executives, consultants, engineers, and city officials gathered around the polished walnut table. Yet she stood perfectly still, her hands folded in front of her, her expression calm. Richard glanced down at the notebook again and shook his head. "You came all the way up here for this." More laughter followed. Someone near the end of the table exchanged an amused look with a colleague. Another executive checked his watch. Maya said nothing. The silence only seemed to encourage Richard. He opened the notebook and flipped through several pages. Numbers, sketches, measurements, arrows pointing toward handwritten observations. Entire sections highlighted in blue ink. To him, it looked like the work of a teenager trying to sound important. "Let me guess," Richard said. "You think you found something our engineers missed." A few smiles widened around the room. Whitmore Dynamics employed more than 800 specialists, structural analysts, safety inspectors, software architects, people with degrees hanging on walls and decades of experience behind them. The idea that a teenager could discover something they had overlooked seemed ridiculous. Richard closed the notebook and placed it on the table. "You know how many people have tried to warn me about projects over the years?" he asked. "Thousands." He tapped the cover once. Most of them were wrong. The room nodded along. Maya finally spoke. Her voice was steady. "I'm not asking you to believe me." Richard raised an eyebrow. "No, I'm asking you to read it." The answer was so simple that it briefly disrupted the rhythm of the room. Richard smirked. Not because the response impressed him, because it didn't. To him, certainty came from success. Success came from power. And power came from being right more often than everyone else. He had built an empire on that belief. The smart tower standing 3 blocks away was the latest monument to it. 106 stories, nearly 1,500 feet tall. Every floor connected to an adaptive AI management system designed to predict energy usage, traffic flow, maintenance schedules, and emergency responses before problems even appeared. The media called it revolutionary. Richard called it inevitable. He stood and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. Far below, construction lights flickered against the approaching evening. The tower rose above everything around it. Elegant, massive, untouchable. Behind him, Maya remained silent. Richard turned back toward the room and smiled. "You know what's funny?" he said. "Everyone thinks the danger comes from mistakes." He pointed toward the skyline. "Most of the time, the real danger comes from people who think they know more than they do." Several executives chuckled. One even applauded softly. Maya looked down at the notebook resting on the table. Then she looked back at Richard. Her expression never changed. That was what unsettled him, though he couldn't yet explain why. She wasn't angry. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't even nervous. It was almost as if she already knew something nobody else in the room understood. And for the first time that afternoon, the billionaire's smile faded just a little. Maya Carter had learned a long time ago that people rarely look twice at someone like her. They noticed the worn sleeves of a jacket before they noticed the person wearing it. They noticed an address, a zip code, a school district, or the color of a person's skin before they noticed the hours of work hidden behind quiet eyes. That lesson had followed her through nearly every year of her life. She lived with her grandmother in a modest brick duplex on the east side of the city, less than 4 miles from the glittering towers downtown, but a world away from them. Every morning before school, she woke at 5:30, packed her books, helped prepare breakfast, and checked on her grandmother's medications before catching the city bus. Most people her age filled notebooks with homework assignments, song lyrics, or messages from friends. Maya filled hers with observations. Dates, times, measurements, patterns, anything that seemed important. The notebook resting on the conference table had started as a gift from her father 6 years earlier. He had handed it to her one rainy Saturday afternoon and told her something she never forgot. "The world leaves clues everywhere," he had said. "Most people are too busy to notice them." Since then, Maya had written in it almost every day. She recorded strange sounds from aging buildings, traffic patterns near construction zones, water leaks, structural shifts, maintenance schedules, small details that seemed meaningless alone but often revealed a bigger picture when viewed together. Her father had taught her how to pay attention. Before he passed away 3 years earlier, he worked as a safety systems technician. He was not famous. He was not wealthy. But he believed facts mattered, even when nobody wanted to hear them. After school each afternoon, Maya spent hours at the public library reading engineering journals, city planning reports, and maintenance records that most people would never bother opening. The librarians knew her by name. They often found her sitting near the back windows as evening sunlight stretched across the carpet, surrounded by stacks of documents and handwritten notes. While other teenagers counted followers on social media, Maya counted inconsistencies. She searched for missing pieces. Questions fascinated her more than answers. That curiosity eventually led her to Whitmore Tower. At first, it was just another project dominating local headlines. Then she noticed something unusual. A public report did not match an earlier inspection summary. A maintenance revision appeared months before a design adjustment was officially announced. Dates seemed out of order. Numbers shifted. Tiny discrepancies appeared and disappeared across dozens of documents. Most people would have ignored them. Maya did not. For 14 months, she kept writing. Every discovery went into the notebook. Every concern, every pattern, every unanswered question. The pages became crowded with arrows, calculations, sketches, and observations. Sometimes she stayed awake long after midnight comparing records beneath the glow of a small desk lamp while rain tapped softly against the window. She never expected anyone important to read it. She certainly never imagined standing inside the headquarters of Whitmore Dynamics. Yet now she stood there, facing the most powerful man in the room. Around her, executives saw a teenager holding a notebook. Maya saw something else entirely. She saw 14 months of evidence sitting on polished wood beneath bright conference room lights. And she knew something none of them knew yet. Richard Whitmore had spent decades building a reputation that few people dared challenge. Newspapers called him visionary. Business magazines called him relentless. Investors called him a guarantee. Every major project attached to his name seemed to grow larger than the one before it, and Whitmore Tower was supposed to be the crown jewel of all of them. The building dominated conversations across the city. Local news stations ran weekly updates. Financial analysts praised its projected revenue. Politicians posed for photographs beside scale models displayed in the lobby of City Hall. To most people, the tower represented innovation. To Richard, it represented legacy. That was why he had personally approved nearly every major decision connected to the project. He remembered the first presentation nearly 4 years earlier. Digital renderings glowing across giant screens. Architects describing the future. Engineers outlining systems capable of monitoring everything from elevator traffic to energy consumption in real time. Richard had listened quietly before giving a single instruction. Failure was not an option. Since then, thousands of workers had contributed to the project. Contractors, consultants, designers, safety inspectors. Entire teams rotated in and out over the years. Yet every important report eventually reached his desk. At least that was what he believed. Standing near the conference room windows, Richard folded his arms and looked toward the distant tower. The setting sun reflected across its glass exterior, creating bands of orange light that seemed to stretch across the skyline. It looked perfect, strong, unshakable. Behind him, several executives resumed discussing preparations for the grand opening. Invitations had already been sent to governors, investors, and media outlets. Caterers were scheduled. Security teams had completed final reviews. Everything appeared ready. Everything except the teenager still standing beside the conference table. Richard turned his attention back to Maya. She remained calm despite the attention focused on her. That confidence irritated some people in the room. One executive whispered something to another and shook his head. A city consultant quietly laughed beneath his breath. Maya ignored them all. Richard had seen that kind of determination before. It usually came from people trying to prove something. But there was something different about her. She did not seem interested in impressing anyone. She simply refused to leave. The notebook remained where he had placed it. Its worn cover looked strangely ordinary among expensive tablets and polished presentation folders. Richard glanced toward it briefly before looking away. He still believed the entire situation was a distraction. Yet a small part of him wondered why she had spent 14 months collecting information if she expected nobody to listen. Most people gave up long before then. Most people moved on. Maya had not. The conference room lights brightened automatically as daylight faded outside. Reflections appeared across the glass walls. The room suddenly felt smaller than before. Quieter. Even the casual conversations around the table seemed less certain now. Richard noticed it too. Confidence remained in the room, but curiosity had begun to replace amusement. Several executives were watching Maya instead of their phones. One engineer leaned forward slightly. Another stared at the notebook as though considering it for the first time. Maya finally broke the silence. "If I am wrong," she said softly, "you lose nothing." Her eyes shifted toward the tower visible beyond the windows. "But if I am right, you still have time." The room went still again. And for reasons Richard could not explain, those 7 words lingered longer than they should have. Richard stared at Maya for several seconds before letting out a quiet breath through his nose. The room seemed to be waiting for him to laugh again, to dismiss her one final time and bring the meeting back under control. Instead, he walked slowly toward the conference table. The polished surface reflected the overhead lights and the notebook resting near the center. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Richard pulled out a chair and sat down. The subtle scrape of wood against the floor echoed louder than it should have. Several executives exchanged confused glances. One of the senior project managers adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. Maya remained standing. Richard tapped the notebook with one finger. "You have 5 minutes," he said. "Show me the most important thing in here." A few people in the room looked relieved. Others looked annoyed. They expected a quick demonstration followed by a polite dismissal. Maya stepped closer to the table and opened the notebook. Page after page revealed tightly organized notes. Dates, diagrams, measurements, references to public records, maintenance logs, inspection summaries. Richard expected chaos. Instead, he found structure. Maya turned to a page marked with a blue tab. "This report was published 18 months ago," she said. Her finger moved down the page. The original design called for one monitoring sequence. She flipped to another page. 3 months later, the sequence changed. Another page followed. Then it changed again. Richard glanced at the notes. "Projects evolve." "Yes," Maya replied calmly. "But records usually explain why." She turned another page. "These do not." A senior engineer folded his arms. "There could be dozens of reasons." Maya nodded. "That is what I thought too." She revealed another section. More notes. More dates. More references. So I kept looking. The engineer stopped talking. Maya continued. She pointed to permit updates, equipment revisions, maintenance schedules, public filings. Individually, none of them seemed alarming. Together, they formed a pattern. Richard could feel the room becoming quieter with every page. The casual confidence that filled the conference room earlier had begun to fade. Even those who had laughed at her now watched carefully. Maya never raised her voice. She never tried to impress anyone. She simply moved from page to page as if she were connecting pieces of a puzzle she had been studying for over a year. The sunlight outside disappeared completely. The city beyond the windows became a field of lights. Inside, the conference room felt suspended in time. Richard glanced toward the tower in the distance, and then back to the notebook. Something uncomfortable was beginning to form in the back of his mind. Not fear. Not yet. Doubt. The kind he rarely experienced. Maya stopped at a page filled with handwritten observations and small sketches. This was when I realized the discrepancies were not random. Richard narrowed his eyes. "And what exactly are you claiming?" Maya looked directly at him. "That someone noticed these issues before I did." The room went silent. One executive shifted uneasily in his chair. Another slowly lowered the tablet he had been holding. Richard stared at her. "You are saying someone already reported this?" Maya nodded. "Yes." "Who?" For the first time since entering the room, Maya hesitated. Her fingers rested lightly against the edge of the paper. Then she turned one more page and quietly answered, "My father." The words settled over the room with unexpected weight. My father. Maya did not say them loudly. She did not need to. The silence that followed seemed to absorb every sound in the conference room. Richard remained seated, one hand resting on the notebook. Across the table, several executives exchanged uncertain glances. A few moments earlier, they had treated Maya like an interruption. Now nobody seemed eager to speak. Maya carefully turned another page. A photograph had been taped into the notebook. The edges were worn from age. It showed a man standing beside a maintenance control panel inside an unfinished section of the tower. He wore a hard hat, a reflective vest, and a calm expression. Richard looked down at the image. Something about the face felt familiar. Not familiar enough to remember immediately, but familiar enough to make him uncomfortable. His name was Marcus Carter, Maya said. He worked on safety systems during the early construction phase. Richard studied the photograph again. Thousands of employees had passed through the project over the years. He could not possibly remember them all. Yet the name stirred something. A memory sitting just beyond reach. Maya opened to another page. Copies of emails had been printed and attached beneath handwritten notes. Inspection concerns. Requests for additional reviews. Questions about inconsistencies in system reporting. Each document carried dates stretching back more than a year. He submitted reports? Asked one engineer quietly. Maya nodded. Many of them. Another executive frowned. If these concerns were real, why were they not addressed? Nobody answered. Maya flipped to another page. Then another. Every page revealed more records. More references. More attempts to raise questions. The notebook no longer looked like the project of an ambitious teenager. It looked like an archive. A record of someone refusing to let information disappear. Richard leaned forward slightly. His confidence remained visible, but the certainty underneath it had begun to crack. He noticed something else. Marcus Carter's observations matched many of Maya's. Different handwriting, different dates, same concerns. The pattern was impossible to ignore. What happened to him? Richard finally asked. Maya's eyes lowered briefly to the photograph. He was removed from the project. A faint tension moved through the room. Richard felt it immediately. He glanced toward several members of senior management. Nobody volunteered an explanation. Removed why? Maya turned another page. A termination notice appeared beneath a plastic sleeve. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. Richard stared at it. His jaw tightened. Near the bottom sat a signature. His signature. The room suddenly felt warmer. The lights seemed brighter. Richard looked again, hoping he had made a mistake. He had not. Years earlier, the document had crossed his desk among hundreds of others. He remembered none of the details. Yet there it was. His name. His approval. His decision. Maya spoke softly. My father believed the project could still be fixed. Her fingers rested against the edge of the notebook. He never stopped trying. Richard looked from the termination notice to the photograph and back again. Then his eyes landed on a handwritten entry beneath it. The ink had faded slightly with time. The sentence was short, just 8 words. But as Richard read them, something cold settled in his chest. Because the date written beside those words was 14 months old, and the warning described a problem his engineers had only discovered 6 days earlier. No one spoke. The conference room that had been filled with laughter less than an hour earlier now felt strangely distant, as if the city itself had drifted away from the 43rd floor. Beyond the glass walls, thousands of lights shimmered across downtown streets, but inside the room, all attention remained fixed on a single notebook. Richard Whitmore stared at the faded handwriting. 14 months. The number repeated itself in his mind. 14 months ago, someone had documented a concern that his own team had only acknowledged 6 days earlier. He slowly removed his glasses and set them on the table. The movement was small, but several executives noticed immediately. Richard rarely paused. He rarely hesitated. Yet now he remained silent. The notebook lay open beneath the white conference lights. The paper showed signs of age. Folded corners. Slight discoloration. Ink that had softened over time. None of it looked important. And yet it had become the most important thing in the room. Maya stood quietly across from him. She did not look triumphant. She did not look angry. If anything, she looked tired. Tired of carrying evidence that nobody wanted to see. Richard glanced toward the photograph of Marcus Carter. The calm face seemed almost alive beneath the protective sleeve. For the first time, Richard found himself wondering what kind of conversations had happened years earlier without ever reaching him. How many reports had been filtered? How many warnings had been dismissed? How many people had been ignored simply because they lacked influence? The thought unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Around the table, executives avoided eye contact. A few stared down at their notes. Others watched the city through the windows. The confidence that usually defined boardroom meetings had vanished. In its place lingered something heavier. Reflection. Richard's hand rested beside the notebook. He could feel the texture of the paper beneath his fingertips. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. Years ago, before the headlines, before the private jets and television interviews, he had been a young engineer carrying notebooks of his own. He remembered being ignored. Remembered presenting ideas to people who never listened. Remembered promising himself that success would make him different. The realization arrived quietly. Somewhere along the way, he had become exactly the kind of person he once struggled against. Maya lowered her eyes toward the photograph. My father used to say that facts do not disappear just because people stop looking at them, she said softly. Her voice barely rose above the hum of the ventilation system. Nobody interrupted. Richard looked at the notebook again, then at the tower glowing against the night sky. The building still appeared flawless from a distance. Beautiful, powerful, untouchable. Yet for the first time, he was no longer looking at the tower itself. He was looking at the questions surrounding it. And the more he thought about those questions, the more one detail refused to leave his mind. Not the warning, not the signature, not even the photograph. It was the date written beside that warning. Because if Marcus Carter had been right 14 months ago, then somewhere in the project records there had to be proof that someone else knew it too. Richard stood slowly and reached for the conference room phone. Nobody spoke as he made a single request. Within minutes, archive project records began appearing on the large screen mounted at the end of the room. Timestamps, internal memos, inspection summaries, review requests. The glow from the display reflected across polished wood and silent faces. Maya watched without saying a word. She had already seen many of these records. Richard had not. The search started with Marcus Carter's name. Hundreds of files appeared. Most were routine. Maintenance recommendations. System evaluations. Technical observations. Then an engineer near the screen froze. There, he said quietly. A document opened. Marcus had submitted a detailed report 14 months earlier. The language was precise. Professional. Supported by data. Richard felt his stomach tighten as he continued reading. Every major concern listed in the report matched issues currently under review. Not approximately. Not generally. Exactly. The room became still. Another executive opened a follow-up record. Then another. More reports appeared. More warnings. More supporting evidence. The pattern was undeniable now. Marcus had not submitted a single concern. He had submitted dozens. Richard watched the dates scroll past. Week after week. Month after month. The reports continued. Yet none of them had reached his attention. Who reviewed these? Richard asked. His voice remained calm, but the question carried weight. No one answered immediately. A project compliance officer searched deeper into the archive. Several folders opened. Internal routing records appeared. Approval chains. Escalation paths. Then a final screen loaded. A silence heavier than all the others settled across the room. The reports had not disappeared. They had not been lost. They had been marked as resolved without full investigation. Richard stared at the names attached to the approvals. Senior managers. Department heads. Consultants. People trusted to protect the integrity of the project. Some of them were sitting in the room at that very moment. One executive removed his glasses and lowered his eyes. Another leaned back slowly, unable to look at the screen. Maya remained motionless. She was not watching the executives. She was watching Richard. For the first time that evening, he understood what Marcus had been trying to do. The reports were never attacks. They were warnings. Honest attempts to prevent future problems. Richard looked toward the photograph inside the notebook. The face of a man he had never truly known seemed to stare back at him across the years. Then the final discovery appeared. An archived email dated 14 months earlier. Marcus had written one last message before his removal from the project. Attached to it was a detailed prediction describing how the unresolved issues would eventually reveal themselves. The room fell silent as an engineer compared the email to the findings released 6 days ago. Line by line, observation by observation. Every prediction matched. The engineer lowered his hands from the keyboard. He knew, he whispered. He knew all of it. Richard said nothing. He simply looked at the date in the corner of the screen. 14 months old. Then he looked at Maya. And in that moment, the teenager everyone had dismissed was no longer standing alone. The truth was standing beside her. The conference room remained silent long after the screen stopped changing. Nobody rushed to speak. Nobody tried to explain away what had just been revealed. The evidence had done something arguments could not. It had removed every place left to hide. Richard stood near the end of the table, staring at the final email Marcus Carter had written. The message was simple, professional, respectful. It contained no anger, no accusations, no attempt to embarrass anyone. It was merely a final effort to protect a project he believed in. Somehow that made the discovery even harder to face. Richard slowly closed the email window and looked across the room. Several senior managers avoided his gaze. Others sat motionless, studying the polished tabletop beneath them. The confidence that had filled the meeting earlier was gone. In its place stood accountability. Maya carefully closed part of the notebook and rested her hand on the worn cover. She had spent years preserving her father's work, years carrying documents most people would have thrown away, years believing that facts mattered even when nobody listened. Richard finally broke the silence. How long have you been collecting all of this? Maya looked down at the notebook. Since he passed away. Her voice remained steady. I promised myself I would finish what he started. Richard nodded slowly. The answer struck him harder than he expected. He glanced once more toward the photograph attached inside the notebook. Marcus Carter had never received recognition, never received an apology. Yet even after everything, his daughter had not come seeking revenge. She had come seeking truth. That realization changed something. Richard walked back toward the conference table. Earlier that evening, he had held the notebook between two fingers with a smirk. Now he lifted it carefully with both hands. The room noticed. Every executive noticed. Every consultant noticed. Even Maya seemed surprised. Richard carried the notebook to the center of the table and placed it down gently. The grand opening is postponed, he said. The announcement landed like a stone dropped into still water. Several executives immediately looked up. One opened his mouth to object before thinking better of it. Richard continued. Every report connected to this project will be reviewed again. His gaze moved around the room. Every decision, every approval, every dismissal. Nobody challenged him. Nobody could. The evidence was too clear. Richard then turned toward Maya. For a brief moment, the billionaire who had spent decades commanding rooms seemed almost uncertain. Your father deserved better, he said quietly. The words were not polished. They were not prepared. They were simply honest. Maya looked at him for several seconds. Then she nodded once. Not in triumph. Not in forgiveness. Simply in acknowledgement. Outside the windows, the tower continued to shine against the night sky. It looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. Yet everything had changed. Because for the first time since construction began, the project was no longer being guided by pride. It was being guided by the truth Marcus Carter had tried to leave behind. 3 months later, the city gathered again beneath the shadow of Whitmore Tower. The difference was that this time, there were no giant banners celebrating perfection. No promises about flawless innovation. No carefully rehearsed speeches about success. The grand reopening felt quieter, more honest. The morning sun reflected across the glass exterior, casting long ribbons of light onto the plaza below. Reporters stood behind barriers. Employees filled the lower steps. Engineers, maintenance workers, inspectors, and office staff mingled together in small groups. For once, titles seemed less important than the people wearing them. Maya Carter stood near the edge of the crowd beside her grandmother. The familiar notebook rested in her hands. Its cover looked older now, softened by years of use, but she held it the same way her father once had. Richard Whitmore stepped onto the stage without fanfare. The applause that greeted him was polite, not overwhelming. He seemed different from the man who had dismissed a teenager inside a conference room months earlier. Older somehow, more thoughtful. Behind him, a large screen displayed a photograph that many people in attendance had never seen before. Marcus Carter stood smiling beside a construction control panel, wearing a hard hat and reflective vest. The image remained on the screen for several seconds. The crowd grew silent. Richard looked up at the photograph before turning back toward the audience. Some buildings are made from steel and glass, he said, but the strongest foundations are built by people willing to tell the truth. He paused. Even when nobody wants to hear it, the plaza remained quiet. A cool breeze moved between the surrounding buildings. Richard continued. Today we recognize someone whose work protected this project long before most of us understood its importance. He stepped aside. A plaque was revealed near the entrance. Marcus Carter's name had been engraved into polished stone beneath a simple inscription honoring integrity, responsibility, and courage. Maya lowered her eyes briefly. Her grandmother squeezed her hand. Neither spoke. They did not need to. The moment belonged to Marcus. After the ceremony ended, people slowly drifted across the plaza. Conversations resumed. Reporters packed away cameras. Employees returned to work. The city continued moving forward. Richard approached Maya near the entrance. He held a small folder in one hand. "These belong to you," he said. Inside were copies of every report Marcus had written, every recommendation, every note that had helped reveal the truth. Maya accepted the folder carefully. Richard nodded once. Then he walked away without asking for recognition, leaving her standing beneath the morning light. Hours later, as the city settled into another ordinary day, Maya sat alone on a bench across the street from the tower. Cars moved through intersections. Pedestrians hurried along sidewalks. Above them all, sunlight reflected from the glass exterior of the building her father had tried to protect. She opened the notebook one final time. Near the back, tucked between worn pages, she found a handwritten sentence she had read countless times before. Her father had written it years ago. The ink had faded, but the words remained clear. The truth does not need power to survive. It only needs someone willing to remember it. Maya smiled softly. Then she closed the notebook, held it against her chest, and watched the sunlight dance across the tower while the city carried on around her, unaware that justice had arrived not with noise, but with quiet remembrance.